Welcome everybody to this workshop. I know we have participants from around the world who have tuned in, so thank you. My name is Sterling Higa. I'm going to be hosting the workshop. I've been involved in British parliamentary debate now for about 8 years. For 5 of those years, I was a competitor, 4 years at the University of Hawaii, 1 year at Harvard, and then for the last 3.5 years, I've been coaching debate at Hawaii Pacific University, where I am now. This is the first in a 3-workshop series. This is understanding the metagame of British parliamentary debate. The second workshop is training for competition, and the third workshop is about how to compete and execute well in competition. Hopefully you'll enjoy this workshop and you'll be coming back for the other 2. Now, I want to start by just talking through what I mean by the word metagame. And this is a word that basically means any approach to a game that transcends or operates outside of the prescribed rules of the game, uses external factors to affect the game, or goes beyond the supposed limits or environments set by the game. And I think that this is highly important in British parliamentary debate, because very often we get locked into thinking about the debate in one way. Now, the workshop goal here for you is to have a conceptual framework that you can use to understand British parliamentary debate, and then to create your own strategy as a debater. So I'm not trying to impose my way of debating on you. I'm just giving you a different perspective that you can use that will hopefully allow you to become a better debater. I'll be talking for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have about 20 minutes for question and answers at the end. So if you have any questions, please write those down, and then we'll be going back and forth in the chat to answer those at the very end. Now, this is, I think, the traditional frame that people have in mind when they think about a British parliamentary debate. So you can see there's an opening government team on the bottom left, the closing government team, a opening opposition team on the right side of the screen, and then I am, in this particular debate, the member of opposition. So I'm standing up and my partner is slightly out of frame. This is the framework we think about debate in, where we think that this is what debate is. And the dominant idea of this workshop is for you to accept and to really understand the implications of the fact that the actual debate happens here, after the debate, when the judges start talking. Now, when this workshop is done, I will send you a link, because the adjudication for this particular round was actually recorded. And so you get to hear about 30 minutes of the judges deliberating which 2 teams should advance from the semifinal round at the Western Regional Championships of the United States Universities Debating Championship. And it is fascinating to hear judges discuss things. Now, I've been coaching debate now for almost 4 years, and I've judged at a number of both US national tournaments and then at Worlds as well. And I've chaired rounds. I've also been on panels with excellent chairs. And it is fascinating. Once you are on the judging side, you realize that the debate you thought took place did not actually take place. And what actually matters is what happens in the room of these 5 people. So I'll send that link if you're interested in watching it. I think it's fascinating to be able to watch a debate round and then to watch the adjudication of that debate round. It's a little bit difficult to appreciate this when you're participating in the event, right? So if you are the judge, you don't observe the adjudication in the same way. If you're the debater in the round, you may not perceive the adjudication in the same way. It is best if you are a complete external observer and you watch a round and then you watch the way that the judges interpret that round. Now, that's the dominant takeaway. So if you sign off now, you'll probably have gotten all of the value. You can derive all of the rest of the implications of this workshop from those 2 pictures. But what we're going to go on to discuss first is what debate is, how you win a debate, and how you persuade judges that you won the debate. Now, the first thing we have to do is examine some what I believe are misconceptions or narrow views of what debate is. So is debate a quest for truth? Which is to say, in debate, are we looking for which team can best approximate what is true and accurate about the world? And I would say that the answer here is no. On an obvious level, because truth does not equate to impact. So both teams, a proposition and an opposition team in a round, can make true arguments, and a judge will still be able to adjudicate between the two sets of arguments. So truth is not the sole criteria for success in debate. And if we imagine that debate is just about saying things that are true, we're probably not going to get very far. Is debate an exercise in logical reasoning? Is debate about your impeccable logic, the fact that you move seamlessly from premises to conclusions, that you warrant all of your statements? And I would say here that once you participate in a few oral adjudications, when you participate in the discussions, or even if you just eavesdrop on discussions, you'll realize that logic plays some role in the decisions that are made, but sometimes teams with impeccable logic end up losing debates to teams with rather unsound logic. There are factors at play beyond mere logic. Now, if it's not these things, and I think that logic and truth are important, let's make that clear. But what is debate if not some aggregate of these things? And I would say that debate is a game of persuasion. It's a game because it has some rules and regulations that shape what happens. And it's about persuasion in that it's about influencing somebody to act in the way that you would like them to act. Now, how do you win the game of debate? Because we know we need to persuade. What are we trying to persuade judges to do? A lot of debaters will just look at the roles that they are supposed to fulfill. You know, opening government has some tasks, opening opposition has some tasks, closing government has some tasks, closing opposition has some tasks. And the presumption that debaters make is, so long as I fulfill my role, I will win the debate. And I don't think that this is exactly what you are trying to do. It is not merely your job to persuade the judge that you have fulfilled your role. What you have to do is outrank the other teams. Your job as a debater is to persuade the judges that your team outranks the other teams. Now, there are a few considerations I think are important, immediate implications of this idea. And they are answers to the question, how do you outrank other teams? The first answer is, to win, you should climb ranks from the bottom. And this is counterintuitive, but I think an extraordinarily valuable approach to thinking through debate. And it is to say that if you are trying to show that you are on top of all the teams, you do not automatically get onto the top. You actually have to climb the ranks from the lowest team to the top of the team, like you were competing in a league and you're trying to climb the league rankings. You don't automatically get to the top. Many debaters, though, imagine that if they make the correct arguments and they fulfill their role, that the judge will clearly recognize that they're on top of all of the teams. Or they believe in a round that if I only beat the strongest team in the round, the judge will automatically recognize that I must have also beaten the second strongest and third strongest team in the round. I don't think that either of these assumptions is proper. I think that the truth is, in every room, you have to climb to third place, then you have to climb to second place, and then you have to climb to first place. And I'll explain a bit more about how to do this in a bit. The last thing is you have to persuade the judges that you won, which means the judges have to know why you won. Now, the reason why goes back to the pictures that we looked at earlier. There's a picture of a debate, and then there's a picture of judges having a discussion after the debate. So the judges need to know why you won. Now, let's talk a little bit about who the judges are. And this is, I think, one of the most important slides because it'll help you avoid a lot of frustration at debate tournaments. I've competed in a lot of debate tournaments. I've had fantastic wins. I've also had upsetting losses. And over time, I've developed a picture of judges are that has become much clearer since becoming a judge myself. Now, when I give you this description of what judges are, I want you to recognize that I have derived this conception of a judge from my conception of myself. So I don't believe that I'm different than this conception. So the first thing to note is that judges are human. which means they're subject to all the fallibility that humans are. Now, humans are ignorant and prejudiced. These words are very important. Ignorant means that they don't know most things. So humans, the quantity of things that you know compared to the quantity of things that it is possible to know is a grain of sand on a beach. So humans are, by definition, ignorant of most things. Humans are also prejudiced. Prejudiced means to judge in advance. So when judges come into a debate topic, they have an inclination towards the proposition or the opposition. Now, we say that judges are going to try to be a neutral observer and be unbiased, or at least to recognize their biases. But all of that is to say that they are prejudiced in one direction or another. And this is the natural state of humanity. All humans are ignorant and prejudiced. Now, if you think about it, prejudice follows from ignorant, right? So if you don't know everything, then all of your judgments are prejudice, right? Because the only way you could form an actual rational judgment is to have access to all the information. But you never have access to all the information. So your judgments are always prejudiced. They always reflect acting before we can have total certainty. Now, humans are also biased. Now, bias is slightly different than prejudice, although we use it often in the same way. What I use bias to mean is bias reflects cognitive biases that shape the way that we process information. Now, if you want to learn more about cognitive biases, I think a great book to start is Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. But the general idea here is to recognize that humans process information in certain ways that lead them to tend towards certain conclusions. And this has nothing to do with their conscious mind, but everything to do with just the unconscious way that we tend to process information. And the last thing to say about humans is they are rationalizing, not rational, which is to say a rational being would weigh out the pros and cons and then select the most advantageous position. A human generally tends to have an impulse toward a certain side and then to come up with reasons why they believe that argument. They engage in rationalization, justification for positions that they've arrived at irrationally. Now, all of this is true of me. It may be untrue of other people. Perhaps, Ashish Kumar is not a human, but this seems to be the case with all humans. All humans tend to have these propensities. They're ignorant and prejudiced, they're biased, and they tend to engage in rationalization rather than rational thought. Now, with all of this in mind, you have to change your expectations for the quality of judgment that you're going to receive at tournaments. Oftentimes as debaters, and I remember this, you go to a tournament and you make a great speech, and then a judge gives you a 2 or a 3 or a 4, and you're like, how is it even possible that a judge could give me this score? They clearly didn't see the round. And the truth is, they didn't. They're ignorant, prejudiced, biased, and rationalizing. Now, the question is, given these restrictions, given these limitations on humans, how should you respond as a debater? And that's what this workshop is about. Beyond these sort of baseline limitations, though, humans have some tendencies, and these are the social tendencies, the social pressures that are coming into play when you're at a debate tournament. And it's important to consider them. A lot of debaters understand the social pressures on themselves, but don't think through the dynamics, perhaps between wings and chairs, or between chairs and adjudication core staff. And it's worthwhile to think those through. So the first thing about humans is they tend to seek recognition. Whether this recognition is positive or negative, I'm sort of agnostic, but I think it's true that at least some humans tend to seek recognition. Now, certainly, this is probably true of your judges at debate tournaments, many of whom tend to be sort of type A individuals because they themselves were debaters and now they want to continue on as judges. A lot of the judges are trying to seek recognition. At many tournaments, there is the judge break, where the best judges advance from the preliminary rounds to the elimination rounds. Some judges perhaps don't care about breaking and don't want to break, but I would say that at competitive international tournaments, many of the judges there that you will encounter are trying to break. They want recognition. There is ego still involved with them. A second thing is humans tend to fear judgment. So just like you as a debater don't like it when you get the 4 or the 3 or the 2, judges are similarly in fear of being judged both by other judges, but also by debaters in the round. Now, this leads to a couple of dynamics. There are some judges who have no judgment to fear. So for instance, if you were a top speaker at Worlds and a world champion, and you go to judge at a minor regional competition, what are the debaters really going to tell you? Are you really afraid of their judgment? Perhaps to some degree you are. If you're the CA of the tournament, who's going to judge you? Not really anybody. But let's say you are a debater. You're a debater who is just judging at a tournament. You're a junior in university and you go to judge at a tournament. You're probably fearing the judgment of these other judges. Or let's say you're a recent graduate, but you as a debater did not achieve much distinction during your time debating. You might be in fear of the other judges. Let's say that you are advanced to become a chair, and one of your wing judges happens to be a highly accomplished debater or somebody who had previously judged you. In that situation as a judge, you will actually be in fear of judgment, and it's worthwhile to remember that. Finally, humans tend to avoid shame and embarrassment. So this is worthwhile to remember when you think about the calls that judges make. Do judges always make the call that reflects the truth of what happened within the round? Or, and this is not to say that this always happens, but just to recognize it as a possibility. Or do judges sometimes make the call that will allow them to avoid any shame or embarrassment? Now, assume that you're a judge in a round and it's 2015 and you run into Harvard A, Bo and Finelli, both of whom I was able to hang out with when I was debating at Harvard. Very nice people. Now, you know Bo and Finelli because you're acquainted with the debating circuit, and they are in your round. Let's say after watching the round, you're pretty sure that they did not win the round. You think that they're in the 2, maybe in the 3. You're the chair. And the wings say, Bo and Finelli were excellent. They totally won the debate. Now, you haven't revealed your ranking of the round yet. Will you fight? I don't know. It depends. I think that it's not right to say that judges will incline in either direction, but you have to recognize that some judges, to avoid shame and embarrassment, to avoid judgment, will go along with what their panel wants, just to avoid any sort of hard feelings. So all of these factors are affecting the decisions that are happening after the debate. Again, this debate is about the metagame, and the metagame is not about what happens in the room. It's not about opening gov, opening op, closing gov, closing op. The metagame is actually about what happens after the round. The metagame is about who the judges are and the dynamics that are happening when the judges sit down to debate what happened. So how then does the judging work? And my personal advice, if you are a novice debater, is to participate in a tournament as a judge, especially now that debating is online. This is sort of easy to do. I would recommend just go to a tournament, pick a small tournament, 4 or 5 rounds, and just judge. You'll learn a lot. There's an asterisk here because this is how judging is supposed to work, or works when it is done right. The first thing is judges will take notes during the debate. Now, this is an important factor to remember, and it is really what distinguishes debate from real-world persuasion. In the real world, people typically don't take notes, which means it's more about the impression you make and less about specific things you say. You don't necessarily get awarded points for making a specific argument if it's forgotten. But in a debate, judges are taking notes. And so you have to remember this restriction in order to make good decisions within a debate. The second thing typically is each judge will rank the debate. So if there's a panel of 3 judges, each of the 3 judges is coming to an independent adjudication of how they saw the round ranked. Now, sometimes judges get away with not ranking specific teams. They'll say, well, I think the 2 and the 3 are close. Sometimes if a judge is really inexperienced, they might just say, I had no clue how to adjudicate this round. But at elite competitions, at Worlds, the expectation in good rounds is that at the end of the round, the judges will have some preliminary ranking. Each judge will have a preliminary ranking of the debate that they saw before the judges compare their rankings. Now, the judges, typically at the beginning of adjudication, will all reveal their preliminary rankings and compare them to see whether they agree or disagree. Then the judges will attempt to justify their preferred rankings, typically with the chair judge guiding the discussion to adjudicate the points of disagreement, though this doesn't always happen. And last, the panel either agrees on a ranking or they vote on the areas of disagreement. And if there are an equal number of chairs and panelists, or sorry, if there's an even number of judges, then the chair gets the rolling vote. Now, to think about this in depth, one thing to recognize is it would be ideal in any debate to rank first on all of the judges' rankings at the end of the round. That's the ideal. Failing that, however, you need to be thinking, what will happen after the round in terms of the conflict between the judges? And where is that conflict occurring? So for instance, let's say there is a round and one team is clearly winning the debate. So the judges all come in afterwards and they say closing opposition won the debate. Let's say you are not closing opposition. And then the judges turn and say, the rest of the debate was a mess. How are you going to distinguish yourself from the pack? Now, this is a question that you have to figure out in the round. If you're opening government and you realize that closing opposition is running away with a debate, then your point of information strategy has to take into consideration, how are we going to distinguish ourselves from the rest of the teams in this round? Because we're certainly not going to beat closing opposition at this point. Unfortunately, I think a lot of debaters don't do this strategic thinking. A lot of debaters don't think about climbing ranks from the bottom or about the discussion that judges are going to have. So in a situation where an opening government team is getting smashed by a closing opposition team, they'll imagine that their heroic POI to the opposition whip is going to be the point that rescues their case and beats closing opposition, and they're going to win the debate. Typically, it doesn't work. Typically, the point just gets completely forgotten. So you have to recognize the dynamic of judging to make good decisions within the round. Now, are judges rational? And we're going to go through some of the rational ways to persuade judges and the irrational ways as well. Because the answer, I would say, is judges are not completely rational. They may not even be majority rational. Judges, I think, are definitely influenced by irrational aspects of performance. So if you read the WUDC judging manual, for instance, it says you as a judge should not be influenced by the style of a speech or by the clarity of someone's speech. You shouldn't dock points for speakers for whom English is a second language. But if you've been to an international competition, you know that judges routinely do this. They do dock speakers. That's not to say that it's right, but it is to say that it happens, that these aspects that shouldn't influence our perception of the arguments very often do. So let's talk through a few of them. The first thing is attire. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you what to wear. But I think that it is safe to say that what you wear does influence how people perceive you. And you can take that to mean what you will. A second thing I would say is the way that we carry ourselves, our posture, influences perception, specifically, I think, by signaling confidence. So there are some teams that just walk into rounds and they have an energy, a confidence, a nonchalance, a coolness, where you think, wow, this must be a really good team. On the contrary, there are teams that walk into rounds and they have a sort of defeated, sagging look where you think, wow, this team must not be very good. This typically happens later in tournaments. Let's say you've just taken a bad loss in round 7 and it's round 8 at Worlds, and you walk into the round like this. I think, based on my understanding of humans, that has to influence the way that the judges then perceive your performance in the round. So it's worthwhile to take into consideration. Now, I also think that your breath, the quality of your speech, the audibility, how loud you are, influences how you are perceived. That's not to say that you should just yell and be very loud. Although if you watch videos of out rounds at Worlds or a lot of international tournaments, I don't think it's a coincidence that a lot of the very high-ranking teams tend to just be sort of very loud and oftentimes on the verge of screaming. It might just be because that allows them to be heard. I think it's worthwhile, though, to remember that you are engaging in a physical action of communication, and being heard involves being loud, and being loud involves taking, big, deep breaths, preferably through your diaphragm. Now, the fourth thing is articulation. So being loud and clear are important in judges making decisions. Now, I think it's not a coincidence that a lot of Commonwealth countries, debaters from Commonwealth countries, tend to do well at international debating competitions. And the reason why is a lot of Commonwealth countries in their primary school and even secondary school education stress articulation, elocution, whatever you want to call it, but they stress properly pronouncing words and speaking clearly. Americans really don't. So if you listen to American debaters, very often they are the worst at this. So when I say that articulation can help judges to understand you, I'm not trying to, cast stones at English as a second language debaters or English as a foreign language debaters. I'm actually casting stones at Americans because I think that Americans do the worst at articulating and making things easy for judges. It's helpful to remember that at any competitive international competition, some of your judges will be English as a second language or English as a foreign language, but because it's an international competition, judges will be coming from places where they are unused to hearing the particular cadence and rhythm of your speech. They will not be familiar with you and your particular speech patterns. And articulating clearly means that more of the syllables and the words that you are saying will make it to your judge than otherwise. The last thing is, I think that the influence that we have on judges as debaters goes beyond just the rounds. Sometimes you might be in a round and you'll notice that a judge is very friendly with one of the teams because they just had drinks with them at the social the night before, or they knew each other when they were both debating on the circuit. And will judges tend to favor these teams? I think yes. The best judges will try to discount this favoritism, but favoritism happens. It's a natural aspect of being human. There's nothing wrong with it. Recognizing it, though, you as a debater can either be upset because you're not part of the circuit and you're excluded, and you can have this, oh, well, we'll just hang out over here and be an island, or you can play the game. I think that one of the best books, and it's a book that you can find for free in PDF versions online, it was published more than 80 years ago now, is How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. Just read it if you're interested in becoming friends with judges. Let's talk about rational ways to persuade judges then. So judges are, I don't think, prejudiced, ignorant, biased, rationalizing. Yes, they seek recognition, they fear judgment, they avoid shame and embarrassment. And judges are influenced by the way that you dress. They're influenced by your posture. They're influenced by all of these things. But judges are also rational. Now, what are the rational ways to persuade a judge that you've won a debate? Because you have to do this too. The first thing I think is you have to organize your speech for the flow, which is to say you have to organize your speech recognizing that someone on the other side of the table is going to write down the arguments. This is primarily for your material, but it is also for the way that you organize rebuttal. For example, if you are responding to an opponent's argument, it is helpful to name the argument you are responding to. It is even more helpful to name the argument that you are responding to in the way that the judge probably wrote it down on the flow. That's just one example of organizing for the flow. Another way of organizing for the flow is the sort of Aristotelian intro body conclusion type speech, where the introduction tells the judge what you're going to tell them in order. So we have 3 points. The body then has the 3 points, and the conclusion then restates what the 3 points were. Now, the reason why this is organized for the flow is not just that it's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, but that it is repeated, which is to say your judges will not be able to write down everything you say. So sometimes, if you have a point, it's helpful to just repeat the tag for that point 3 times so that the judge has 3 opportunities to write down the tag. Now, when I say a tag, what I'm referring to are the single sentence summaries of your arguments. And I believe, personally, that tags should be concentrated arguments, which is to say, it's one thing to say, in this speech, we're going to talk about geography, economics, and international relations. I think that that's fine, but it would be better to give the tag of each of these arguments. So what is the specific argument? Usually this comes in the form of a declarative sentence that explains what your team is arguing for each of these 3 points. The reason I say concentrated argument is you have to recognize that the judges are going to have a debate about the debate after the debate, which means they are going to try to actually reconstitute what happened in the debate. So a concentrated argument is like concentrate, orange juice concentrate, and the judge afterwards is going to take the orange juice concentrate and add water. Now, you want to have a concentrated argument that the judge will be able to reconstruct the logical links because they're not going to write down everything, that they'll be able to understand the impact of the argument because it's implicit within the structure of the tag. All of that should be contained within the tag so that even the worst judge, because you will hit the worst judge at the tournament, even the worst judge, if they wrote down the tag, will understand the argument. Now, is this always possible? No, of course not. But I think it is an ideal toward which you should strive, to use your tags as concentrated arguments so that your judges will be able to understand what happened in the debate, even if they only wrote down 3 lines. Third is to make your arguments true and impactful. I think a lot of debaters arrive at the first thing, making arguments true. The question then is, well, what does it mean to make something impactful? My specific definition of impact is all argumentation should descend to the level of human suffering. That's my idea of impactful. The reason why is that is, I think, in most debates, most judges are humanists. That is the impact that I think they find most salient. Occasionally, you'll find judges who believe that humans are a scourge on the earth and we should prioritize the birds and the bees and the trees. These are the Lorax judges who speak for the trees. But most judges, human suffering is going to be the most impactful impact. So you want, obviously, to prove the internal links of your argument, the facts upon which your conclusions rest, but you also have to prove the impact. Why is this important? Why does this matter for the judge? And the why is this important? Why does this matter? Always, I think, has to descend to the level of human suffering. So if we increase unemployment in Germany, that's an impact. What does unemployment do? Well, unemployment means a lot of people are out of work. So they either have to go on government assistance, but if there is not enough government assistance because unemployment is so widespread, these people then are in poverty, which means they can't afford healthcare. It means they can't afford education. And in the worst scenarios, it means they can't afford food. Beyond that, their children, because the children lack healthcare, education, and potentially food, may grow up permanently stunted, so that their future life potential, economic potential is inhibited. Beyond this, because the people are extraordinarily unhappy because of unemployment, they may start to vote for populist parties. The populist parties may, because they're reliant on the support of the general population, start to be oppressive towards minorities, as populists often are, which means the least well-off people in the society who are now unemployed and were already minorities may become the targets of violence, right? So we're just building this out, hypothetical argument. But if we just say, blah, 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 this will increase unemployment in Germany, that's like bad, but that's not an impact. It doesn't descend to the level of human suffering. Fourth, I think that a rational thing to do in a lot of situations, especially on back half, is to interpret the motion, to say what the motion means, and to show why your understanding of the motion is most correct and other teams are not correct. A fifth thing to do is to set burdens. So this is related to motion interpretation. It's to recognize that certain teams need to do certain things to win in the debate. If you're opening government, for instance, you might say, here's what we need to prove on government. And then you might say, here's what opposition needs to prove to win this debate. Burdens help to make it easy for judges to make adjudications between teams. They provide bright lines that judges can use. They can easily say, well, did the team meet this burden? And if they believe that the burden is fair, that's an easy way for a judge to give one team the rank over another team. A sixth thing is to use metrics. Metrics are ways to measure things. So which side of the debate causes more conflict? Which side of the debate prevents unemployment? These are metrics: violence, unemployment, death. These are all different metrics we can use to adjudicate which side is winning the debate, related to burdens, but a metric is a specific measurement. A seventh thing is to weigh or lose. So when we talk about the comparative or weighing, my personal belief as a judge now is we're just saying, tell me why your team is beating the other teams in the round. So if both of your arguments are true, why is your argument more impactful? If both of your teams are strong, why is your team stronger? Just engage in the process of weighing. Okay, now I want to go through a couple of case studies. And this is where I'll give you a scenario. You'll think of a response and maybe just type it in the chat, because there are 9 people here and I would like everybody to be able to participate. And so if you would like to participate in the case studies, just type in the chat your response. So we have 3 case studies. The first is, you are an opening government team. You think that you've beaten opening opposition. Closing government has clearly beaten you, and closing opposition is roasting you alive. Okay, you're opening government. You think that you beat opening opposition. Now, on the back half, you're just getting beaten by both teams. The opposition whip takes your point of information. What do? So I'm going to take a sip of water, but take 30 seconds, just sort of brainstorm a response. What are you going to do? The opposition whip is taking your point of information. Perfect. So we'll just go with Jason's response, because Jason got it correct. Jason says, ask them a targeted question about a poor argument or framework set by opening opposition. And this is exactly right. Now, I want everyone to see why. The reason why is you are losing to closing government and closing opposition. And you know this. which means if you are climbing ranks from the bottom, the only team at this point that you can realistically beat, given 15 seconds, is opening opposition. Now, many debaters imagine that they're competing against closing opposition in this situation, but they're not. You're actually just trying to persuade the judges that you've won, which is why Jason is correct that what you should do is either to point out that you've beaten opening opposition, or actually that's it, just point out that you beat opening opposition. Next case study. Case study number 2. You are a closing opposition team. Opening government has provided one metric, so a way to measure the debate. Opening opposition has provided another metric, and closing government has provided a third metric. So you're closing opposition, and all 3 teams have 3 different metrics for adjudicating who won the debate. The question is, should you add a 4th metric to the debate? Okay, so this is a bit tricky. Now, my personal belief is in almost all situations, the answer is no. In almost all situations, you should not add a 4th metric to the debate. And the reason why is, in order to make it easy for the judges to adjudicate between teams, all you have to do in this situation is show that you've beaten each team on their own metric. And the judge will look at that and say, you have crossed 3 bright lines and you have therefore beaten 3 teams. If you add a 4th metric, if the 4th metric is completely perfect and it's the best metric and it really is much better and more accurate than any of the other teams, their metrics were abusive, then yeah, you'll probably win if you add a 4th metric. However, if you are so skilled a team that your 4th metric has not been thought of in the debate so far, you should probably be able to beat the other teams without adding a metric, I think. So I think in most situations, you would not add a 4th metric. Of course, there are always exceptions. Now, the last case study, and then we'll go into questions and answers, and we'll have 15 minutes for questions and answers, is you are the member of government. The opening government team was decent. The opening opposition team were novices. They were quite bad. So if forced to choose, should you focus on proving the uniqueness of your extension or refuting opening opposition? I'll give you just a few seconds to think about this one. So this is where I'd actually disagree with you, Jason. I think that if forced to choose, you should actually smash opening opposition. And the reason why is the only round that you have to win at a tournament is the final round. Most times in tournaments, your goal is just to accumulate points. And the way that you accumulate points is by outranking teams, always climbing from the bottom to the top. In this particular round, let's say you do have to choose between time, and you dedicate your time to proving the uniqueness of your extension. The judge ultimately says, you know, closing government, we heard your extension and we just didn't think it was very unique. We just didn't buy your extension. And there were some things that opening opposition said that we thought you really need to respond to, but you just didn't. In this situation, as closing government, there is one team in the round that you can guaranteed outrank, I think, in almost every situation. You can't control closing opposition because their extension might be fire and you might lose to them. the split between opening government and closing government is going to be adjudicated oftentimes by what the adjudicator thinks. But if you comprehensively smash opening opposition, you take a POI from them and they still can't rescue themselves, you can outrank them, I think, every time. And so my personal read in this situation is to focus on smashing opening opposition. Now, obviously, this is not for every situation. And if you are an excellent debater and you're winning rounds all the time, you'll probably be able to do both. But if I have to choose within a round between trying to go for the 2 or guaranteeing that I get the 3, I'm going to guarantee that I get the 3 every time. Because if over the course of 9 rounds, my goal is to get 2 points every round so that I can break, it is way worse for me to get a 4 in any round than it is to risk getting a 3 over the 2. All right. So in summary, debate is a game of persuasion. Winning means outranking the other teams, and judges are not rational. They're rationalizing. So to win, I recommend that you persuade the judge that you won by climbing ranks from the bottom and rationalizing the judge's irrational vote. That way, when it comes to the adjudicators, they will be picking your team over the other teams in the round. Thank you very much for listening. And now we have about 14 minutes for question and answer. So feel free, just type your question in the chat box and I will do my best to answer it. And if I really don't know how to answer it, I'll note that as well. All right, I'm not seeing any questions. I'm guessing if, here we go. How would you recommend acting as closing government if your opening government's model is poor? Should remodeling be a top priority? This is a tough question. I have been in situations in round both where remodeling worked and where remodeling did not work. And what I mean by did not work, I mean it got my team the 4 in the round. My personal take on closing government remodeling is it is very risky. And so it is a strategy that should be employed only rarely. And it is a strategy that you should employ recognizing the risk that you are taking. Most of the time from closing government, I think, if your opening government has really just squirreled or they've done a terrible job, you might be in a position where you cannot win the round in that situation. So a lot of times, I think you can engage in mitigatory action, starting with points of information to opening opposition. So a lot of times, if the opening government model is bad in the PM, you can offer points of information to the LO that point out some of the flaws in the model and try to shift the debate back to advantageous ground. Once you get to the member government speech, though, I would say I wouldn't make it a top priority. And the reason why is if the judge does not accept your remodeling, you may be heading for the 4 within the round. I think your top priority in that situation is defeating opening opposition, or failing that, to find principled reasons that go beyond the effect, right? So a lot of times a model is premised on having a certain effect or having a certain outcome. there are usually principled reasons to support a policy that do not depend on the outcome. And those reasons become more important anytime your model is likely to fail. So for instance, if you go back to Bowen Finele, Harvard A, the Thessaloniki World's final, this house believes the poor would be justified in pursuing a total Marxist revolution. Opening opposition, Harvard A were opening government, and they said that they should have a full-on Marxist revolution. Opening opposition points out that in a great many cases, the revolution will fail and these people will die. To which Deputy Prime Minister Finele says, the resistance of evil is a good in itself. Even if you die, it's justified to fight. Notice that this argument doesn't depend at all on the model working, right? The model of Marxist revolution doesn't need to work. So let's say you're in this particular situation where you are closing government and your opening government's model is poor. One approach is, well, I'll come up with a better model that works. A better approach is to say, are there arguments on our side for why we should do this, even if it doesn't work? If you can find those arguments, then you can still get the one in the round, even with a weak opening government team ahead of you. And then your second priority, I would say, would be to have tremendous rebuttal to opening opposition so that at the very least, you're not getting a 4 within the round. The judge will look at that split and very clearly say, well, we think closing government did a good job coming out ahead of opening opposition. If you do that, it is also likely that you will outrank opening government because, as you noted, opening government has a bad model. And if there are arguments remaining from opening up, typically if an opening government team makes a really bad model, they're not going to respond to all the arguments of opening opposition. So the judge will look at the round afterwards and say, closing government really smashed opening opposition. Opening government's model was really bad, and opening government didn't respond to opening opposition, so they must be ranked 4th. Opening op then must be ranked 3rd, which means you are ranked either 2nd or 1st. So remodeling, I don't think, is necessary in this particular case to win. The risk you take when you remodel is that you get the 4. And I don't like the 4. That's my goal in competition, is never to get the 4. Thank you. Good question. Any other questions before we break for today? Thank you all for your attention so far. Hopefully this was useful. While I wait for the questions, the next 2 workshops, the second workshop is about training for competition. I'll be talking about how you can organize practices. I'll also be talking about 20 different exercises that you can use to improve different aspects of your debating performance. And then the third workshop is going to be about actually competing. Question says, how long should a debater read every day? It depends on your goals, to be honest. When I was debating, I tried to read every issue of The Economist every week. And in addition to that, I read books. A lot of debaters will just read the news. I don't know that it's particularly helpful to say read the news for 30 minutes to an hour every day. I think it's actually a better approach to say, what am I weak on? What do I not know about? And then to research that. So this read every day, like, is it going to be 30 minutes or an hour a day? I think it's better to just think like, every day I'm going to try to learn something that I don't know, whatever that is. So an example, there was one debate I had about Korea where I just realized that I knew nothing about the Republic of Korea. I didn't know its structure of government. I didn't know about its relationship with North Korea. I didn't know anything. And I resolved after losing that round that I would never lose a round about Korea for not knowing things. There are other reasons to lose a round, but I wouldn't lose a round because I didn't know anything. And so I made it a goal to learn about Korea, and I read a lot of articles about Korea. But I didn't approach it in terms of like, oh, I want to read 30 minutes a day. It was more like, I'm just going to read about Korea until I feel like I know enough about Korea. But I would say 30 minutes a day is a good start. Whatever's convenient for you. Good question. Other questions? Just to build on that response, I think it is more helpful a lot of times to read books than it is to read periodicals. And the reason why is books will typically provide more examples. The logical reasoning is often more clearly explained in a book than in a short form article in like the New York Times, for instance, or any other major periodical. And books are often an expert on the subject writing about it, whereas journalism, like an Economist article or a New York Times article, is often a generalist person writing about the topic, so they don't really have expertise. So one approach to learning about international affairs, for instance, is you read The Economist, you read the New York Times, you read these Al Jazeera. My approach was there's a book called 10 Maps That Explain the World by Tim Marshall. I think that's the title of the book. And this book just goes through 10 different maps and it explains the geopolitical implications of the 10 different maps. Now, that was more useful than reading 700 pages of news or whatever amount of news I would have read otherwise, because I then had a framework for thinking through geopolitics. I didn't need to have the specific names of countries or the specific leaders. I could look at a map and see rivers, mountains. Here's how this is going to play out. So I think very often when we think about reading as debaters, reading shouldn't be focused solely on periodicals, but should be focused on books that will give us frameworks that will allow us to think through various debates. Hopefully that is helpful to answer your question. Can you touch much on the irrationality of judges? Besides attire and articulation, are judges taking things like immutable characteristics into account? For example, speakers who use African-American vernacular English, how would one counter this? So yes, judges are definitely taking immutable characteristics into account. There's no doubt that judges may potentially be sexist, racist. They may have particular ethnic disagreements, right? How would one counter this? The first thing is to be technically excellent. And that has nothing to do with the speaking, but the actual content of the speech. Technical excellence, I think, is undeniable. If you look at sort of the best speakers who have sort of transcended biases on the world stage, I think the quality they have in common is just being great. Another thing that I think is helpful is to become familiar with circuits. So if you can compete in multiple competitions, especially now that things are online, if you can make your presence known and get to know judges, I think that can help to overcome some of the immediate bias, right? So let's say somebody has a sort of implicit bias against a certain racial group. That implicit bias may not be as strong if they personally get to know that person. So sometimes it's just a matter of getting to know judges and becoming familiar with them. And some of that just has to do with showing up and being present at a lot of tournaments, which in the past was hard for a lot of geographically isolated schools. But now with online debate, you can really get yourself into a circuit if you're dedicated about it. But it's tough. I think, there are certain aspects of it where you can't overcome the bias that is there. But my general approach with debate has always been to think the bias exists, the judges are imperfect. How can I work around the edges? Awesome. I think we have time for one more question. So if anyone has one more question, toss it in the chat and then we will wrap up for the day. All right, I think this is a good place to stop. Thank you so much for attending. There will be 2 more workshops in this series. The next one will be on Wednesday. And the third workshop I actually had to move. It was previously scheduled to be next week Saturday, but it'll be the following Wednesday as well. If you are here at this workshop, you will receive the emails with the recording of this workshop, plus the information on the subsequent workshops. Thank you for your attention. Hopefully you got something valuable out of this, and I will see you for the next workshop. Have a good one.